What's up? How you doing? It's Jared. Sebenza 21, large Inkosi. And these knives look very similar. They obviously carry similar design cues. They're both made by Chris Reeves. Did you hear that? Listen to this, right? Drop the Allen key. They're both titanium handled, bead blasted frame locks, S35VN, same blue thumb stud, same pocket clip. There's a lot of similarity between these knives, right? But they're kind of deceptionally different, actually. And I really appreciate the way that both of these things are constructed. You've probably seen the inside of a Sebenza. Take all these out. I'm going to get into these screws here in a minute. What I'm going to do is depress this lock bar to actually take tension off of the pivot screw, because that pivot screw is in both of these scales and it's got tension on it now because of the lock bar. So just relieve that pressure. Look at that. I got pivots falling out. Where'd that come from? That came from the back. I want to make sure my screws stay orientated, right? Take the top scale off. It's my washer. And get into that washer in a minute. Alright, that's really all the disassembly I got to do for that one. Now listen to this. Alright. Take this screw out. You may think, oh, you got to be careful because you might mess up the orientation and confuse it with one of your Sebenza screws. That's just not the case. I'll show you why on that one in a minute. Kind of an interesting little factoid here, right? This Inkosi's got this dual pivot, right? And when I actually bought it brand new from Chris Reeves, and it came with 2 Allen wrenches. One of them is a 1/8 that'll come in, and the other one is a 3, number 3. And you can't use a number 3 in this pivot. So I had to get my own 1/8 inch wrench. Doesn't matter. They sent me the wrong wrench. And I mean, how easy is that to confuse? You can't really blame them for that. But at the same time, if I didn't have a set of Allen wrenches, I wouldn't have been able to disassemble this Inkosi. Look at the size of this screw. This is a waste. I'm going to get into what I mean by that. It's not bad at all, but do the same thing to press that tension. And nope. 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 That's not moving. So, again, keep that tension off. Push the pivot out. Move my blade. You can see that lock bar makes full contact. There is full contact there, so it gives you a good life. It's got a good long longevity. Now, see it moved. Wiggle it. See if I can pry that side up a little bit, pry this side up a little bit, and kind of walk it off, right? I'm going side to side. Walking it off. This side's loose now, so I can just kind of spin it a little bit, and it'll pop off. You can see my washers there on the inside of this Inkosi. There may be easier ways to disassemble this thing, but they are not. This knife is not as user-friendly. That's not to say it's difficult, because that process, I mean, it isn't a difficult process. There's barely any parts to this, right? What I was meaning by this thing is a waste, right? I think if you would have made the pivot screw a little bit smaller, right? You actually make the screw smaller, and that way you could make the barrel thicker, right? Because you keep the same diameter of the actual stop pin, but you make the screw smaller, and so the hole would necessarily be smaller. Therefore, this pivot, or the actual part that's taking the stress, could be stronger, right? So this is just a waste, but it's not bad because this is still an extremely strong pivot. This is kind of an unnecessarily strong pivot. It's huge, right? I mean, in comparison to what's in the Sebenza here. So it's not it's not a negative, but at the same time, I think that could have been done better. As well as these washers, right? Because when you're running a Sebenza, right? I'm just going to leave that on there, okay? Here, I'm going to pull up this side. It's actually moving, okay? You can imagine you've got this bushing system here. The bushing system is holding this washer in place, right? And those are called grease pockets. The reason that there's holes in these blades is it does a couple things. It minimizes the friction because there's less surface area, less surface contact between the actual washer itself and the blade. And so there's less friction there, and it makes it smoother, easier to maneuver. And as well, it holds grease because you can see right in there how all that grease is scraped up around the edges. It's scraped up around the corner of this hole. And the reason for that is it's spinning. This washer is moving and picking up that grease and moving that grease. Every time I move the blade up and down, it moves this washer, spins it around, and picks up and scrapes more of the grease, right? Which applies it to either side of the blade, getting it into the mechanism, spreading it between the washer and the blade. Those are grease pockets. That's functional. It works, right? This Inkosi design here, you can see it's braced by the stop pin. It's stalled out, which does a couple things. It makes the action smoother because you're only moving one part. You're not moving multiple parts, and so there's less energy to actually move the blade back and forth, open and closed, which is a positive. But these are not grease pockets. Those are only functional as ways to minimize the friction in this oversized washer because it doesn't move. The washer, it never moves, and so the blade never makes any contact with the areas of the actual titanium on the scale itself, right? Does that make it, And so the grease just stays, that grease just stays there. You can see that's newly applied grease, and it's never moved. It's never done anything, and it's not ever going to do anything. The only thing that's going to do is collect gunk. And so by making these washers immobile, you've actually negated that aspect of it being a grease pocket. So really these washers are just designed to be smooth. But with that, it actually does work. They really do work because the washer's not moving really does make it so the only thing moving is the blade, and it really does have a difference. It's not anything crazy, it's not mind-altering, anything like that, but it's there, and it definitely is noticeable now that both of these knives are inherently broken in. If you're not familiar with the way a Sebenza works, right, you can see the washer actually, well, I'll stick my blade back on here, right, and so that bushing, right, you hear about the bushing pivot. That bushing is actually what is separating these two scales apart, right, and it's perfectly sized so that the washers and the blade are the exact same height as that, see, it's inside there now, as the actual bushing itself, that bushing itself. And so there's no friction on the blade. When you torsion that screw all the way down, you're forcing the scales to collapse in on the actual bushing itself. On this actual bushing is the only thing that's getting pressure. And so that's what gives you your, that free floating motion, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that the Sebenza has the feel that it does, is because there are so many moving parts. You've got the actual motion of the bushing itself going in the interior of the blade. You've got both of the washers moving around the actual, in the actual mechanism itself. And so that's what gives you that feel. That's what actually attributes to that. It's not smoothness, it's the Sebenza feel. It just feels different than most other knives. The Inkosi here doesn't feel like that. The Inkosi really does feel more like just an extremely smooth, I would equate it to more like an axis lock in actual motion. The locking and the detent feel nothing like that. But the actual motion of the blade is just really smooth. It's just a really smooth action. But the Inkosi here really does show just precision on this blade, because you can look at the ball track. The track for the actual detent, right? The detent hole is huge right there. You can see that. But look at where it lies. It runs along the edge of that blade so close. It is so close to the edge of that blade. And if you saw my Inkosi video, I was talking about the function of this, how it's just kind of got a really strange feel to it. And the ball track, look where the ball track comes in, right? And it ends there. So that's where it pops up, and it rounds over this corner here and then falls into position there. And so you've got all of that travel along that corner. You can see it's kind of deformated and beat up. That's all been, that's just from that little ball. And so that's actually what's giving that little bit of extra kick and a little bit of extra pop, and me moving it when I'm, actually closing the knife, is it rounding around that little corner there. I think that's really interesting. As well as they don't have, if you've been watching a lot of videos on the Inkosi, you may have noticed that when they first introduced this knife, they had a little ball track, right? There was a little groove actually cut into the tang of this blade for the ball to follow, and they've stopped doing that because they said that it's just not beneficial for the amount of work that it creates, it's not beneficial to the design, so they quit doing it. And this is just a flattened surface there, which is interesting because it's stone washed, right? Which means it's not actually finished. This blade was cut like this on a CNC machine, run through the stone wash, and then put out here. Opposed to something much more traditional, 90% of folding knives out there, you can see that it's been cut. This has actually been fitted. The face of this lock, that lock face there has been fitted to the actual frame of this knife. But because this runs on this little ball lock right here, it's running on that rounded surface, they didn't actually need to fit or finish the end of this tang. So that's just CNC. It carries the finish the whole way through, which is good for aesthetics. I mean, it looks really good, but I don't, it makes it a little bit less special, just in that aspect. It's not less quality, it's not less anything else. It just makes it kind of, when it snaps together like that off of the line, why in the hell am I paying $450 for it? But the way that ball lockup is actually, the way that ball is mounted in there, you can see that they've squished the titanium. There's little cuts on either side of the titanium, and then they squished in the little bits over the actual ball there. And so that's what is holding that in. And that was a big concern for me when I got this knife, is how is that thing actually mounted in there? But I've got a lot of confidence in that. That ball is not going anywhere. I imagine you could be, this titanium would bend down here before that ball would come dislodged. So that's nice. But you can see the way that the washer here, I'll move this washer up. You can see it sticking out right there just a little bit. It can actually stick out like that. When I reassemble this knife, which I'll do right now, actually, no, let me show you these screws, right? And the reason that I couldn't get these screws screwed up is they're completely different. You see that? And it's kind of shitty, because one of the reasons that the Sebenza screw, it's famous, you know what I mean? This has got a lot of respect for it. And what it's doing, you can see that it's a cone shape there, right? And so when it actually goes into the little cone shaped hole there, you can see how it fits. It's being pulled down, right? And so you've actually got that mating between the screw itself and the titanium scale, as well as it's a very precision cut screw, right? And so the threads are very tight into the female section of the actual, of the pivot itself, or whatever, whatever spacer or whatever it is. And so you've got that tension pulling the screw apart. You're literally pulling the screw two different directions. You're pulling it down from the force of the threads and up from the force of the actual mating between the scale, right? Which isn't the case with the Inkosi here. You can see the way the Inkosi screw is cut. I can get this, come back into focus here. The way the Inkosi screw is cut, it's just flat, right? It's just a flat surface. And that actually mounts up to the top of the, top of this barrel spacer here, which I'll get into in a minute. But it does make it easy for reassembly. A good reassembly trick, right? Because it kind of sucks trying to keep your pivot in, because the pivot it just constantly falls out when you're, what? I'm gonna do it like this. Take my little paper towel, put the pivot on. I'm going to use this paper towel to hold the pivot in. Keep everything there. I'm not too worried about it being dirty, and honestly I could probably run this Inkosi dry for a little bit. Just break it in a little bit more. I did for a while. I was running it dry for a while, but I mean, look at how few parts this is. Realistically, it's a bitch to do, and it's not easy to get back together, right? Watch. This process here is a little bit tricky. So I've got to make sure that this, you can see that's already sitting down on there, and that can't happen because that cants the scale. And if the scale is canted in either direction, it's too tight of a tolerance between the actual stop pin itself and that hole. And so it can't be canted at all. It's got to go perfectly down there. There's a little bit of wiggle room. That tiny bit of wiggle room is actually what you want to use to get the knife back together. Let's see if I can do this. Come on, man. Yeah, give me a second. Okay, what I wound up doing right there, actually I think maybe a good trick. I pushed the pivot out majority of the way so it's still holding the blade in place and that scale, but it's just kind of sitting out from the actual washers itself. So now I can just depress the lock bar and stick my pivot back in. So I think that's a neat little trick. I was talking about the screws. You see how close of a fit that is, and it's flat on the surface. And so you still get a little bit of that aspect of the screw tensioning itself down, you know, the torsion in the actual, or the, you know, the stress in the screw itself, but you don't get that binding action from the actual mating between that cone surface and the titanium. And so these screws work, but I mean, and they're still good because you can tighten it down, and I'm not going to put any like Loctite in there, but I do think that it could probably benefit from it, honestly. But at the same time, Chris Reeves knows what he's doing. Maybe time will tell. You see that? That's stiff. Tough, right? So I'll just back it off a little bit. And that is a benefit with the Inkosi design, is I can choose how much tension I want in the actual knife itself, which is nice. Check my lockup. Lockup's good. Blade centering is actually off, but it's off to this side just a fraction, just a tiny bit, but it's always been like that, so it doesn't bother me too much. Take my Sebenza. And the way that they suggest, and I actually do prefer to assemble a Sebenza, is going to require me to wipe it down and actually clean it out a little bit. While I'm here, talk about this stop pin, right? This is the stop pin bushing for the Sebenza. And if you remember, I was talking about how soft it is. You can see those. Look at the flat spots on there. Each one of those is a time that I've reassembled this knife, and it's moved. And, you know, when it moves, it gets a new little ding in it, right? And so every time I reassemble this knife, I put a new little dent on it somewhere. You can see that one's really big. I beat that one up. But I'm going to take this area because it's not affected. It's the only not affected surface on it that I have. Take that off. I'm going to need my washer. Hold it like that and get both of those in. Take my scale. And I've got this kind of strange, because you can see how high that is writing. And the reason I've done that is it actually sits flush with the top of the scale. Well, it did, now that it's sticking out. Come on. Doesn't want to come off. Who sees what I did there? You guys see what I did? I was so concerned with that stop pin there. I was like, wait, what the hell's going on? I'm a freaking idiot. And I didn't put my backspacer in. It makes me wonder how far along I would have gotten in reassembly there before I would have noticed that. No, I mean, obviously not very far. I did, but yeah. Now it sits flush. So that, and so it's indented on the other side. It's pretty far back on the other side, but I'll show you that in a second. I'm going to put these screws in, tighten it down, take it out, about 3/4 turn. Same thing with this one. I'm actually going to come back. I love how you reassemble a Sebenza. This shit's just cool. Yep. All the other screws are tightened down my pivot. And this right here really is special, right? Pivot, I'm gonna bend that. See that? I'm bending that Allen wrench. I'm tightening that pivot down so hard. That really is something special. But these are very different knives, but they're both excellent, right? But they're for really different reasons, you know? The sound is excellent on both of them, right? I love the Inkosi's thud while opening the... It's just got that singular click, as well as on the closing. It's kind of subdued. It's subtle. Opposed to the Sebenza closing sounds like a raindrop falling on glass. That's just beautiful. And then the opening as well. But it's, you know, if you watch a lot of Sebenza videos, if you own a Sebenza, they all sound the same. They all have that very specific sound. There isn't enough information out there on the Inkosi, you know, but it sounds pretty much the same on all the videos that I've seen. It's excellent, but so if you really have an itch for a Sebenza, if you're just like, oh, I want to know I want to experience it, what everybody's talking about, why people love this knife so much, don't buy an Inkosi thinking that it will satisfy that urge. You know, make it so that you understand the Sebenza and the Inkosi, right? Because that's just really not the case. These knives look very similar, but they are not. They're not the same. That's it. Y'all have a good one.